Thanks a lot. So welcome all. Welcome everyone. So to another edition of the Africa Game Developers Monthly Meetup. Today we are starting the first of a three-part series focused on storytelling for game development. I'll be your host, Douglas. And it's a pleasure to invite Simon Jones from the UK, who's an experienced story writer and also been able to win an award on the same. So I'd like to welcome him to share more about what he's done, what he's doing, and then be able to kick off today's session. So welcome, Simon.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Nice to meet you all. Right, I'm just going to try and share a presentation here, so bear with me 1 second. Okay, can you all see that?
Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
Fantastic. Okay, yeah, so I'm going to be talking a little bit about storytelling in games. About myself, I'm a writer. I write serialized online fiction. So every week I put up new chapters that people can read. I've been doing this for about 5 years now. These are the books that I've put up. I'm currently working on something called No Adults Allowed. These can be found on sites like Wattpad and Tapas. In the day job, I work here in the UK at the National Centre for Writing. We're an organisation that supports writers at all stages of their careers, whether they're just starting out or they're already published and looking for further support. We do a weekly podcast, we have free resource packs, that kind of thing. So if any of you are writers, I do recommend checking out what we do. Although we're UK-based, we do work internationally with all sorts of partners and always doing new interesting things to help writers all over the place. In terms of games development, I'm probably the odd one out here in that I'm definitely not a games developer. I have dabbled with interactive fiction. That's kind of always been my main area of interest, primarily because not having any coding skills whatsoever, I kind of focus in on the writing, and I've done a few mini projects in Twine, kind of exploring interactive fiction and branching narratives and that kind of thing. But I imagine pretty much everyone here is going to be a lot more experienced in terms of game development. But hopefully what I can do is talk a bit about storytelling and how it can relate to games and how it can be used. So to kick off, there's a question which is what makes games unique? And I think the kind of easy answer that people come to a lot is interactivity. It's kind of the obvious thing that marks games out, but I'd actually argue that that's maybe not the case because all forms of storytelling are interactive in some form. When a story is told, it becomes interactive, whether it's a movie or a book or an audio drama or just a story being told around a campfire. As soon as you see it, is automatically kind of interacting with it and interpreting it in their own way. So if interactivity itself is not kind of the main factor, what is? And what I'd like to do in this talk is to kind of compare literature and games and how they each approach storytelling in slightly different ways and where they have similarities and crossover and where they differ. At the end of this, we can do Q&A, but I'll zip through these slides to start with. So looking at where games and literature do cross over, we have narrative genre, which is this kind of shared thematic language that books and movies, games all share. So I think we all will have encountered games that exist in fantasy genre, science fiction, cyberpunk, kind of action thriller, horror, war, that kind of thing. These are very common genres to find in games and in other forms of entertainment. Some genres that currently aren't very well represented in games, I'd say, are romance, comedy, crime, and literary fiction. So these are very common in books and movies. And although you do get the occasional game that kind of dips into this, it's quite rare to find, for example, a comedy game where the whole point of the game is to be a comedy and to be funny. You get some visual novels that are kind of exploring romance element, but you don't get it in the same way you get romantic comedy or the romance genre in novels. So it's kind of areas that maybe are interesting and rich to explore for game developers if they're looking to do something slightly different that kind of exists outside of the typical gaming genres of, you know, war and zombies and that kind of thing. But with games, it's not just about narrative genre, and this is where it gets really interesting, because it's also about mechanical genre. So with a book, the act of reading it is completely identical for every single book. Doesn't matter what the book's about or which author wrote the book. When a reader picks up the book, the process of reading it is the same, even if the content is very different. With games, it's very, very different in that depending on the mechanics of the game, the way the player interacts with it and interacts with the story will vary massively. So these are some common mechanical genres that I'm sure you're all very familiar with. So we've got first-person shooters, third-person shooters, beat-em-ups, puzzlers, action RPGs, platformers, that kind of thing. And each of these have completely different ways of interacting with the game. And it's particularly interesting if we look at first-person shooters and third-person shooters, because first-person and third-person are obviously narrative points of view that are used in all forms of storytelling and in literature as well. But in games, they kind of function differently. So in literature, you can have first-person stories, you get third-person omniscient, which is where the storytelling viewpoint can kind of jump around multiple characters in whatever way the author wants. You get third-person limited, where it kind of focuses in on particular characters, but it's still in the third person. In games, you also have a second-person perspective, which is actually quite uncommon in literature because it's difficult to write and it's challenging for readers to read. But in games, it makes a lot of sense. So, for example, if you're doing an interactive fiction story, the game will often refer to the player as you. So, you know, you go to the north, you pick up the object, that kind of thing. So that's a point of view that you get a lot in games because the player is directly being put into the position of the protagonist. If we focus in on first person, this is where it gets particularly interesting, I think. So in literature, in a book, the idea of a first person narrative usually means that it's very intimate. You get to see the inner thoughts of the character. It's very character focused. You get a deep insight into their personality. It's all about an empathic approach to the character. So as the reader, you become very, very close to that first person narrative that you're reading. Whereas in video games, first person tends to mean this kind of thing, where you're running around shooting monsters in the face. So it's a very different kind of concept of what this stuff means. And this affects the way stories are told in games compared to other mediums. So if we look at something like the Half-Life series, which are regarded as, you know, some of the best first-person shooter games ever made, but the central character that you play, Gordon Freeman, you don't really know anything about him. You never get any insight into his personality or his inner thoughts. And that's very different to how you'd expect a first-person novel to exist. So the idea of how you tell your story is functionally very different in computer games. You have things like big role-playing games where in the Elder Scrolls games, it's curious because these games actually give you the option of toggling between a first-person viewpoint or a third-person viewpoint. And this is done so that players can just choose which they prefer. And it is more about the mechanics of it. But in terms of the storytelling, as a writer and as an author, it's a very odd concept to let the reader choose the perspective, because when a writer is putting a book together and deciding whether to do first person or third person narrative, they don't just kind of pick it at random. They choose it for a very specific purpose, to best tell whatever story they have. So the idea that in games the player can choose what they want to do and how they want to encounter it is a curious one. And it's almost like the developers are kind of abdicating their responsibility to the story. But that's because games are not just about story, they're also about the interaction of the mechanics. And these two things have to work in coordination with each other. More recently, I say more recently, I mean, Dear Esther is now several years old, but this is a type of first-person game that is probably closer to what we think of in first-person literature. So it's games where this kind of walking simulator game where very little happens, but they're kind of these beautifully crafted, much more internal monologue, exploring a character kind of approaches. This is where the story is given much more prominence than the sort of game mechanics themselves. So it's kind of a new way of telling stories that only emerged over the last kind of 8 to 10 years. If we look at structure, this is where things get really interesting from a writing perspective. So if you look at a book, it's all very fixed. So the duration of the book is entirely fixed. You know, when it gets published, it has a certain number of pages, and that's not going to change. There's no progress gating. So when a reader is reading a book, they can turn the pages without any problems. They don't have any kind of barriers or challenges to turning the next page. The book ends when you get to the end. It's chapter-based. The pacing is entirely controlled by the writer. Everything is very linear. And crucially, to read a book, you only need one skill, which is the ability to read. If you can read, you can basically read any book. How much you understand the book will depend, and how much you enjoy it will obviously vary. But the process of reading it is simple. You know, if you can read one book, you can read any book. With games, it's all much more fluid. So the duration of a game can vary massively depending on how the player goes through it. Usually progress will be gated in some way. So there might be a puzzle you have to solve or combat that you have to beat. The end of the game is when some kind of victory conditions are met. So it's not quite as simple as, you know, reaching the last page. It's more complex when it comes to games. They're also non-linear. They can change their pacing and form and the order in which things happen. And critically, you often need multiple skills, and across different games, those skills will be very different. So if you're playing a first-person game, the skills required to progress through that will be very different to if you're playing a platformer or a point-and-click adventure. So just because you can play one type of game well doesn't mean you'll be able to play other types of game. So in terms of challenges for people who want to tell stories through games, you have to consider that the player will control the pacing of your story. Player skill does impact on what your story is trying to do. So for example, if you want to tell a heroic story in which the player is playing some kind of big heroic protagonist that goes around and saves the world, in a movie, you can do that very easily because you're controlling exactly what happens. In a computer game, it would not be unusual for this big hero character to accidentally get stuck on a door or press the wrong button and not be able to do something, or they drop their gun by accident, and that's the end of the story, and the player has to go back. So in terms of that kind of, in terms of the story making sense, the player will continuously be working against your efforts to create a satisfying dramatic system. And perhaps the biggest factor is just the length of games. So books tend to have a fairly fixed duration. Obviously, it varies from genre to genre. Movies tend to be about 2 hours long, whereas a game can vary between 5 hours to 40 hours, up to 100 hours for particularly large role-playing games. And the idea of telling a tight, cohesive story over 50 hours is not something that any kind of novel writer will be used to. This is a kind of classic plot structure that you might see in movies or books. This is how a writer might design the structure of their book. So you start off at the beginning, and then you have the rising action in the middle as the plot establishes itself. If you Google kind of plot structure or classic plot arcs, you'll find all sorts of diagrams like this. And you get to the climax at the end, and then you have the finale. In games, you don't have anything like this because the way the pacing works and the structure will depend totally on what the player decides to do. Particularly the more free-form the game gets, and if it's a big open world game, you've got very little control over how the player is going to encounter the story. And the critical thing is that players are not going to respect your story. So whether this is in the middle of a very emotional, dramatic scene, the players jumping on a table and knocking over physics objects and poking NPCs in the head, they're not going to be taking things seriously, or at least it's very difficult to get them to do that. And you're not going to be able to assume anything. So with a movie, a film director can genuinely assume that an audience is going to sit in their seats in the cinema and watch the film. With a game, who knows what the player is going to do? So there's some developers who have tried to tackle this. That game company who made Journey had some really interesting ideas for how story works and how multiplayer works. So they heavily restrict what the player can do. And in the multiplayer parts of the game where another player could join your game and accompany you, there's very, very limited ways that you can interact with each other. You can basically kind of make little beepy noises at each other and follow each other around, but there's no other interaction. And it means that in terms of what's happening, the interaction with the other players and what the player can do never breaks the fiction of what is happening, which is very effective in terms of the storytelling, but in terms of giving the player agency and giving them choice in terms of how they do stuff, it's obviously very limiting. So depending on the player, they might actually react against that. There's a game that came out called Spec Ops: The Line, which was a third-person shooter, and there's a point about halfway through the game, I think, where the game forces the player to do something really awful. It's basically a horrific war crime, and you can't avoid doing it. So the game forces you down this particular route. And a lot of players didn't like that because they were saying, if this was me, I wouldn't have done this. And the game should have given the choice for the player to not do it. Except the game was trying to make a point that in war, bad things happen. Yeah, that's the story the game was trying to make. But it's where you have to be very careful in terms of how much freedom you do give players, and increasingly players expect branching narratives and multiple options and that kind of thing. BioShock is another really interesting example. Can't believe that came out in 2007. That seems like a ridiculously long time ago. But that directly comments on player activity and player agency, and kind of makes the point that players often are just kind of running errands and doing what they're told, and whether that is a good or a bad thing. It doesn't quite follow through with its ideas, but it's a really interesting sort of meta insight into game storytelling inside the game itself. So it's not all challenges and restrictions, though, because as game designers and game writers and narrative designers, we get to do all sorts of interesting stuff, like branching plots and having the player define their own protagonist, and the player becomes an active participant rather than just a passive interpreter of what you've made. They become an active member of the cast, if you like. And also, every single member of the audience for your game has a personal version of the story. And obviously, with anything like movies or books or comics, every audience member will interpret that bit of art in their own personal way, but the way the art is delivered to them is always going to be the same. Whereas with games, the actual delivery of the story has the ability to change as it goes along. So there's all kinds of exciting stuff in games, and I think that's why it interests me and why it excites me, because storytelling as a form in cinema and in literature is fairly well defined. It's not changing massively anymore because they've been around for decades or hundreds of years. Games are still relatively very young, and particularly in terms of storytelling, there's a lot of ground still to explore and discover and try new things. There's a kind of mantra in storytelling, which is show, don't tell. So rather than directly telling readers something, it's more interesting to show it to them through action or character interaction. And I think in games, the version of that is do, don't tell. So games are all about action, not necessarily like big combat action, but it's about players doing things. And the more you can tell your story through them doing stuff, the more interesting and effective it is. If all the storytelling is done in cutscenes, then it raises the question of why don't you just go and make a movie, essentially? Whereas if you can integrate your storytelling into what the players are doing, it's much more immersive, it's much more satisfying. So I'm just going to quickly zip through various approaches to storytelling. Yeah, then we can do some Q&A at the end if you like. So design approach 1 is when you use games to tell your story. So this is when telling a story is your primary motivation for the project. You have a story that you want to tell, and you've chosen games as the way you're going to tell it. So the Mass Effect games are good examples. It's got heavy emphasis on player decisions and consequences. The player can create their own character, which gives a very personal experience. So this picture here is the Commander Shepard that I designed, and throughout the 3 games I played as that character, and no one else played with a character like that. And that's something that only games can do. You know, if you watch a TV series or a movie, everyone sees the same actor playing that role, whereas in games you can really personalize it in to the player. The GTA games, for better or worse, really want to be gangster movies. They kind of force these stories into the games that don't always mesh perfectly with the games that they've made. So I find increasingly that the GTA stories are kind of at odds with the silly things that you can actually do in the games. And as the games have become more realistic in terms of their visual presentation, the stories have become increasingly uncomfortable in terms of their violence. But that's just my opinion. Like in a GTA, you can the mechanics. So when you're just like going around the city doing whatever you want, you're very free. As soon as you engage with the story, you can do less, which seems like a weird approach to me. If we go back in time a little bit, you have point-and-click adventures like The Secret of Monkey Island and all the other ones that came before and after that. And these are interesting because most point-and-click adventure games are exactly the same in terms of what you can do. The thing that is different is story, the narrative itself. And that's kind of an interesting approach where you have essentially the exact same game over and over again, but with different stories being told. You know, these were essentially story engines that were used to tell stories. These have kind of evolved more recently into stuff like Life is Strange, where you have a story that is gated by various puzzles. And this is where game design has to be working in tandem with the story. So your story can really suffer if the player bumps into a puzzle or a challenge that they simply can't do. It's that thing I was saying earlier about when you're reading a book, nothing stops you from turning the page and reading the next bit. Whereas in games, you can continually get stuck and have kind of hold-ups in your experience of the story because the game aspect is causing you some kind of problem that stops you from moving forward. And while that can be satisfying and engaging from a game perspective, it can really harm the storytelling because it becomes very disjointed. Another interesting approach is adaptations and adapting other forms into games. So this is very much where you've got a story that exists as a movie or book and you want to make a game version of it. This can go very wrong with licensed versions of movies. The 80s and 90s in particular were very bad. But then you have better stuff like 80 Days, Inkle, where they adapted the novel Around the World in 80 Days and turned it into a really slick, elegant, interactive fiction that is massively branching, but it still gives the feeling that you get when you read a novel, except you're much more in charge of what is happening. Highly recommend checking it out if you're interested in branching narratives and that kind of thing. And it's interesting to think about in terms of this approach. If you somehow removed the game would the story still work? So with the Mass Effect games, if you took out all the role-playing stuff and the cover-based shooter, would the Mass Effect story still function? And it probably would. And the interesting follow-up question to that is, if you can do that and the story still works, then should it even be a game in the first place? I'm not saying that it shouldn't, but it's an interesting conundrum where if the game mechanics aren't interacting with the story directly, then why did you decide to make it as a game rather than a movie or a TV show or a book? So looking at things the other way around is when you want to use story to enhance your game. So this is when you've got a great game already and you want to apply some story elements to enhance it in some manner. And I think Subnautica is a fantastic example of this, where they had a really good survival game, they had an amazing world to explore, really interesting interactions with the environment and in terms of how you survive and build new things, and didn't really need a story. But what they did is hired a very good writer, crafted a story into this world, and the story basically improves all of your interactions and experiences in the game. So although it's not, strictly speaking, necessary, it's kind of like a multiplier that makes everything else you do in the game have more context and be more satisfying. Heat Signature is a little indie game by Tom Francis, and this is interesting because it uses kind of emergent procedural concepts both for its levels and for its storytelling. So the storytelling is very, very thin, but it's just enough, again, to give context to what you're doing. Not strictly speaking essential, but having these little character bios gives you a reason to go and sneak around on these spaceships. And I think it's a good example of story just being applied in a very thin layer just to kind of bring the game to life a bit more. Into the Breach, a fantastic indie game. It's a tile-based, turn-based strategy game where you're in robots attacking monsters, essentially. Didn't really need a story, but again, they applied lots of background story elements and little bits of dialogue that pop up so that it really gives personality to what you're doing in the game. And it's just that little bit of extra motivation. So people compared this game a lot to chess, just in terms of kind of how it works and the way it portrays information to the player. And chess doesn't really have a story, but it does present itself as being kind of like a war between rival powers in terms of the knights and the kings and queens and that kind of thing. And you could look at chess as an example of where the people who came up with chess in the first place applied this little thin layer of story on the top to give it this extra motivation. Red Faction Guerrilla, another good example where they had a great physics engine where you could destroy things, and they came up with a story that matched the technology they had for the game. So they basically came up with a justification for why you're going around destroying all these buildings. So the story is kind of woven into the mechanics, unlike in the GTA games where I feel like they're sometimes reacting against each other. So in terms of emergent storytelling, people don't talk about scripted story moments. The emergent stuff always feels personal and unique and worth retelling. You don't get people talking about big stuff, big story moments in a Call of Duty game, because in that, it's exactly the same for every single player. Whereas when someone plays Heat Signature or Subnautica or one of these games that has this kind of emergent storytelling potential, that's when people want to share the stories that happen to them because it only happened to them. And that becomes a really interesting kind of, almost like a kind of oral tradition of telling stories to each other, but motivated and created by games. And in this case, it's kind of the other way around. So if you took the story out, would the game still work? And I think in those examples I gave, you could remove the story and you still have really great games. But what the story does is just adds context and a bit of flavor to what you're doing. So the third approach, the last one to talk about, is unified writing in design. This is where story and the mechanics of the game are kind of inseparable. You can't think of them as being apart. For me, The Witcher 3 did this really well. It's a really interesting adaptation of novels into games for a start. So it's kind of got this literature origin that then becomes a game. But in terms of the stuff you do in the game, everything backs up and supports the idea of the central character. So a bit like we were saying about Journey earlier, where it really limits what you can do, so that the only way to engage with it is on the game's own kind of agenda. With The Witcher 3, the stuff that you can do as a player is what the player character of this kind of monster hunter would do. So you never do anything that breaks the fiction and the immersion of who you're playing. It's also interesting in that it's a third-person game. So it's a third-person viewpoint. You see your character as you're walking around in the world, but it's also a fixed character from the books. So it's not like a classic RPG where at the start of the game you design your character and it's kind of a blank slate that you fill out. In these games, you are playing a defined character, and the writers know who he is, the player knows who he is, and everything you do in it kind of backs that up. Another interesting example is the Doom remake from a few years ago, in that although you might not think of it as being a kind of classic story-based game, because it's very much all about big action, but again, everything you do in the game is encouraging the personality of the character you're supposed to be playing. So there's kind of a humor and the way cutscenes work, and just the way you interact with weapons and stuff. All of it is supporting the story that they're trying to tell, which is a very simple story, but they do it in a very effective manner. I also want to talk a little bit about environmental storytelling, which is something that really games are particularly well suited to do. So this is when your story is told through background details, and the story is something the player can discover and it's optional, so they can engage with it as much or as little as they want. And this gives the impression of the world existing beyond your actions. So stuff happened before you as the player arrived in that world, and it will continue to happen after you go. So Half-Life 2 is a good example of this, where as you move around the world, just by observing the spaces you're in, you can start to figure out the story and the history of what's happened here. And very little of the story is actually told through cutscenes or dialogue. It's very much in the world, and it's you observing it. And this is particularly special because it gives the player the feeling that they've worked it out. It feels like a lived-in world that you're discovering for yourself. And can't really do this in other forms as easily. So movies visually can do this, but you're still being directed by the cinematographer and the director and the editor. Whereas in games, it's entirely up to the player where they go and what they explore. Dishonored did this, so does Deus Ex. These are all about spaces that you poke around and discover. And I think one thing that's particularly beneficial about this is that it's up to the players how much they do this. So if they want to just run through the levels and be stealthy or shoot things, they can do that. But if a player wants to take their time, look around, discover stuff, then the game supports that as well. Left 4 Dead is an interesting example where it's this multiplayer zombie shooter. Didn't really need much in the way of story, but they layered on lots and lots of environmental storytelling and kind of background dialogue, so that there's this extra element of context for players who are interested in it. Players who aren't interested in it can just ignore it. So yeah, it kind of is a good way of adapting to different player types, because if you have loads of cutscenes and story that you force the player to watch, then there will always be some players who just don't want that because they're not so interested. One thing that is rarer but really interesting is when the way that you interact with the game, like the physical action of pressing buttons on a gamepad or a keyboard, is used in some way to help the storytelling. So Brothers is a really fascinating example of this, where you play these two characters, but it's a single player game. So you have one controller, you're playing these two characters, one with each thumb, essentially. And throughout the, 10-hour game, your brain adapts to understanding that your left hand is controlling one brother, your right hand's controlling the other brother. And then at a pivotal moment in the game, one of the brothers is taken away and you're only controlling one of them. and the physical impact of one of your hands suddenly not doing anything is really emotionally impactful, and it kind of backs up the story that they're telling in a very physical way, because you suddenly feel this loss, as if you have suddenly lost a connection to one of the characters. Her story is another example of kind of presenting a way of interacting with the game that is very specific to the role-playing elements, in that you feel like a detective poking through this computer trying to uncover evidence because of the way the game presents itself. Papers, Please, really amazing indie game from a few years back, where what you're doing is fundamentally quite boring. You're a border control agent and you're stamping papers and doing bureaucratic work, but through the kind of drudgery of doing this every day, it starts to tell a story where you really empathize and get into the head of the person that they're portraying. So when you are tempted towards taking bribes and corruption becomes part of it, you kind of really understand why a person might do those things. So the game is very much about empathy. It's about understanding why good people might do bad things. And if it did this through cutscenes and tons of dialogue, it wouldn't be as impactful, because then you're observing someone else telling the story. Whereas the way the game forces you to confront those decisions yourself, you end up with a much deeper understanding of why a person in real life, in difficult circumstances, might make decisions that on the surface look like bad decisions. So if we return to that first point at the start, which is what makes games unique, it's kind of everything. I think that's why they're so exciting. But really, it's about the player being able to affect the way a story is delivered. So all forms of storytelling are open to interpretation. They all have interactivity, because when you tell a story, the audience interprets it in some manner. With games, you can let the player control how that story is delivered as well. And when it's most effective, in my opinion, is when the narrative genre, so the type of story you're trying to tell, is matched up perfectly to the mechanical genre that you're in. So the way the player interacts with the game and interacts with the story directly supports and backs up the story that you're trying to tell. So yeah, hopefully that was helpful and interesting. You can find me on Twitter and on my website if you want to find out more stuff. I occasionally write articles about storytelling and that kind of thing. But yeah, hopefully that was useful and interesting. Yeah, I'd love to hear what some of you guys are doing in terms of storytelling in your games.
Thanks so much, Simon. That was very insightful. So I'll open this up to the audience for questions.
I have a question. Hello?
Yeah, go ahead, Ahmed.
Sorry. Is the element of having a storyline always a successful game is always pegged to the fact that you always have to have a successful storyline, or you have to have a good storyline, or it's you could in essence also design a game without having a story. It can still be successful.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say it's entirely optional. I mean, there are games that have very little story in them at all, and I think a lot of people don't want story in their games. You know, there are significant numbers of players who want a game where they do stuff and there's some kind of challenge, but the story is not an element that they're interested in. And in fact, you know, the more story there is in the game, the more annoying it can be sometimes. For me personally, I love games with stories, but it works for me best when the story is kind of interacting with the game in some way. So I'd much rather have a good game that has a little bit of story than have, you know, tons of story that doesn't have a very good game. Because if the story's good but the game's not good, I'd much rather go and watch a movie or read a book. So with games, the game has to come first, and how much story goes into it, I think, depends on what you're trying to do with it.
Okay, so what you mean is the games. Is there a situation where, for instance, the game can come as a result of the story, or not the story comes as a result of a game?
Yeah, I think so. And I think a lot of games come about because the developer wants to tell a story in some way, and they've chosen games as the way they're going to deliver it, for whatever reason that may be. It could be that that's where their skill set lies, and they, you know, making a movie is very hard, and writing novels is hard in a different way. Games are a completely valid way to tell stories, and if the main thing you want to do is tell a story, then games can be a fascinating way to do it. And you do see some games which are, you know, wholly narrative based, and there's very little kind of interaction with the player, but they still exist in the space of games because it's, you know, there's a bit more to it than just reading a book. Like maybe there's dialogue choices or that kind of thing. And I think, like I was saying, the Mass Effect games are interesting for this because they're so story heavy that it's clear that developers, you know, really wanted to tell that story, and they just kind of happened to tell it via this kind of third person cover shooter. But you could almost take that story and apply it to any type of game. Like the story is not tied into the things you can do in that game. And I think it's because first and foremost they wanted to tell that story, and then they kind of attached it to a particular type of game.
I had a question on the perspectives. You mentioned that there's the first, second, and third when telling the story. Could you clearly define the three? Because I got confused when you mentioned with the second person's perspective. You talk about you, but also I guess it also happens in the third. So I couldn't really tell the differences between the three.
Yeah, sure. So just to go through them one by one. So first person perspective, particularly in terms of novels, it's when it's written from the point of view of the character. So they'd be saying things like, I walked down the road and I did this, and you get to hear their thoughts directly as if you are them. In gaming context, first person usually refers to when you are seeing directly through the eyes of the person you're playing. So first person games like Call of Duty or Deus Ex or the Half-Life games, that kind of thing. Second person perspective is quite unusual in literature because it can feel a bit awkward, and this is where it's written more along the lines of you do this and you do that. And in a book that can feel very strange if you're reading a novel and it's saying things like you're thinking this and you went along to this room and did this. But in games it can feel much more natural because as the player it is you that are doing it. So in a book it's a bit odd because the book's already written and you're being told that story. You don't have a chance to influence it. So being told that it's you can feel really odd. In games, it's much more natural. That said, I mean, you mostly see it in interactive fiction where it says stuff like, you know, you turn on the lamp or you pull out your sword or you can go to the north or to the south. Which one do you want to do? But it's kind of directly addressing the person that is playing. And I guess other context might be if you're playing a role-playing game, it could, you know, if you're getting the kind of updates on the combat stats, it could say you dealt 10 damage to the enemy, that kind of thing. So that's kind of the gaming equivalent of second person. Third person is where the viewpoint is outside of the protagonist, outside of the character. So in books, it's where you're seeing the story from the perspective of various characters, but you're not in their heads directly. It's very much like, you know, this character went and did this and they did this. In games, third person is usually when visually you see your character and the camera is probably, you know, just behind them or just over their shoulder, that kind of thing. And yeah, so in terms of literature and games, there's kind of similarities and crossover in terms of how those perspectives are used, but they each work slightly differently as well. Like I was saying about first person in a book, first person normally means it's very intimate, it's very close to the character. In games, usually it means that you're running around with a gun shooting lots of stuff, which is not quite the same. I hope that made sense.
I have a comment. So, thank you. When it comes to the linear media, which is books and movies and music, every time you read a book from start to finish, if you read it 10 or 20 times, it's exactly the same experience, exactly the same line that you took, even when it comes to movies. For example, you've watched Avatar. There's no version of Avatar where the soldiers win. It's always the same ending. Same with music. It started the same way 10 times before, it ended the same way 100 times before. But when it comes to video games, even if you played the same video game, no two experiences are the same. And that's why I think this media is like so unique. That's why so many people enjoy it. You don't have the exact same, everything is different all the time you play it, even if it's the same game, even if it's the same settings. So when it comes to storylines, I think the developer just sets the rules of the game, and then the player just explores. They might end up at the same place. For example, Call of Duty, it has a storyline, but you get to experience it in different ways every time you play it. So that's why I feel this medium is so unique.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, even something as simple as just how the player walks from one place to another can change the feel of the story that they're experiencing. Whereas, yeah, in a movie, the way a character moves through a scene is always going to be the same. What I would say, though, is just to counter that slightly, is that one thing that's interesting, even in linear media, is the context in which you watch a movie or read a book. So if you read a book when you're 15 and then you read it again when you're 30, it can actually come across as a very different story.
True, yeah.
It's
different because you have changed.
Yeah, or it could be that world events, something happens in the world that puts a different perspective on it. So there is always that element of interpretation that comes into it, but you're completely right in that, you know, the text on the page is always the same.
There's a question on the chat box from Angelina. At what point will storytelling come in during the development of a game?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I mean, I can't speak to that personally because I'm not a developer, but as part of my job at the National Centre for Writing, I've interviewed a couple of narrative designers, John Ingold from Inkle Studios, who's just a genius at this kind of stuff, and Kelsey Beecham, who was the lead writer on Outer Wilds last year. And basically it varies massively, I think. So if you look at big AAA games, quite often the writing team come in fairly late in development. So they'll bring in some writers to kind of add flavor to whatever they're doing. And the story is kind of added on to whatever the game already happens to be. Whereas on smaller games and indie games, quite often the writer will be in there from the start, and there'll be more interaction between the writers and the designers. So Kelsey Beecham from Outer Wilds was saying how the designers of that game would come up with ideas that they'd give to her, and then she'd write some stuff. And if she came up with an idea in the writing, she'd put it back to the designers, and then they might tweak the level design to better suit her ideas. So it was kind of a two-way thing. But I think it just changes for every team and every developer and how developers approach it. I think if you go back sort of 10, 20 years, writers and storytelling was always an afterthought. It was something that came in at the end and no one really cared about it. Whereas these days, I think more developers are taking it more seriously and kind of bringing it in at an earlier stage of development, which is great.
Dennis?
Hello, I had a question, yeah?
Yeah, go ahead, Roy.
Oh, okay, sir. I just wanted to find out, it's interesting you spoke of Specs of the Line. I also played it and I found it very interesting. It was a very good game to play. Then I had, now you mentioned something about people, a little bit of backlash towards the game, and my team and our team were having some bit of a challenge when it comes to writing, like, for current events, like, let's say with the COVID going on right now, and what is your moral? I just wanted to find out what is your moral standpoint on, like, where do you draw the line on how do you tell the story, and does it really, or do you just do the story then deal with the backlash later, or especially when it comes to games, because as you say, like, it's, like in the game, the spec of the stories are a bit driven by the player, by the developers. So where do you draw the line, especially when it comes to storytelling?
Yeah, it's a really hard one, isn't it? I think I'd say you can't think about the audience too much, really, because if you obsess too much about what an audience is going to think and how they're going to react, then you're going to be second guessing yourself, and you're going to be kind of almost censoring yourself because you're worrying about what other people are going to think. And if you want to tell a story, you have to stick to what you think is the point of that story. So whatever it is that interests you, you just have to stick with that, and then hope that other people in the world are thinking in a similar way to you. And there will always be people who don't like it. Like, it doesn't matter how popular something is, there will always be people who really hate it. So it's a tricky one, but I think if you try and do something that will please everyone and won't cause a backlash, then you risk ending up with something that is very mediocre or kind of flat in its storytelling, because it's trying, not to offend anybody. And then nobody is going to be interested in it because there's nothing to get your teeth into. So I'd say, as long as you've clearly identified the themes that you're exploring and what the purpose and the point of your story is, then you just have to kind of stick with it. And then how people react is never really going to be in your control, which is not a very useful answer, I suppose. But yeah, it's a tricky one.
All right, thanks.
Hello. Hey, Simon, I would like to seek a further clarification. Sorry to take you back on the perspectives.
Sure.
You mentioned, it seems like on the second and third perspective, they're all more of reported or reporting of sorts. So does that mean that for each of them, you need a narrator of sorts? Because I'm trying to distinguish which point is a because the third one is more of godlike, so there's the pure narration kind, but the second one I'm trying to piece it in terms of who is their narrator, or are you the narrator, or I'm trying to figure that out.
Yeah, that's a good question. In terms of, I suppose, with the second person, where the story is it feels like it's directly addressing you. In that case, that there is a kind of separate narrator, and the impression that the writer's trying to give is that they're talking directly to you. So it's kind of trying to, I suppose it's trying to simulate that feeling of being in a room with a storyteller, like, around a campfire or that kind of thing, where they're telling you what happened, and trying to draw you in. It's slightly different to the first person, where it's very much meant to be your inner thoughts, and instead it's this kind of potentially anonymous narrator telling you what you did and what your options are. I think the reason that can work better in games is because what that narrator is telling you that you did is usually a consequence of some decision that the player made. So you make a decision, and then the game says to you, "You did this," and it feels like exactly, it's like cause and effect. Whereas in a book, for example, it can be jarring and a bit weird, because if it's using that same perspective and it's saying you did this, you did that, as a reader, you're kind of like, well, no, I didn't. I've got nothing to do with this. Whereas in books, it creates that kind of nice loop where you make a decision and then the game confirms that you did it, and because of that, something else happened, that kind of thing.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Anyone else with a question?
Hello, Douglas and Simon. Thanks for the opportunity. So I had a question. Bede nasikika?
Yes, we can hear you.
So when you're doing indie development, budget is of concern, and animation can be expensive. So you can prefer using text to carry the plot. What are the pros and cons of using, let's say, text, and is animation worth it when you have budget concerns?
Yes,
I think
that's a really good question. Yeah. I mean, I think text as a way of telling a story is very proven. Like, it's got centuries of history behind it as being a really good way of telling a story. And particularly for indie developers, or if your project is on a tight budget, text is basically kind of free. Obviously, you're paying a writer and there's the time to make it, but once you've written some text, it's doing the job. Whereas, as you say, if you want to have elaborate cutscenes with characters and animation and that kind of thing, it immediately gets more complicated. And the other thing is that well-written text immediately is professional and engaging and works really well. Whereas if you have animated characters and voice acting and all that kind of stuff, it has to be perfect or it's terrible. And that's kind of the big risk. So even massive budget games often get this stuff completely wrong and either have bad voice acting or the animation's not quite there. I think some of the Ubisoft games are doing amazing stuff with their animation now, but that's because they have thousands of people working on every single game, and it takes years. So yeah, I think it's always figuring out that kind of scope question is so important, isn't it? In that you don't want to try and be too sophisticated in your presentation and fall short. It's better to kind of scale back a bit and then do it really well. So a game I've just been playing called Cloudpunk, which is a interesting cyberpunk indie game. It's really nicely written. It's got really good writing. There's no animation or anything. It's all kind of text-based, but it does have voiced acting. And the quality of the voice acting is quite variable. So some of it's really good and some of it is not very good. And part of me thinks that they might have been better doing the voice acting and just having the text on the screen, because then there's nothing to pull you out of it. And if you look at 80 Days, the game I mentioned talk, that's only, and it's the effect presentation, very simple, but it just works and the writing is exquisite. So as long as you're okay with reading, you're into the game completely. That said, obviously, you look at stuff by Naughty Dog, like Uncharted and Last of Us, and clearly loads of people absolutely love those games, and the fidelity and quality of their acting and animation is astonishing. So if you can do it to that level, then that's great. But there's like 3 studios in the world that can do that. So yeah, I don't think to tell a good story, you don't need to be Naughty Dog. Basically, like you can still tell brilliant stories even if you don't have that kind of development budget.
Joel, I hope your question was answered. The floor is still open. Anyone else with questions?
Yes, I have a question.
There's some also on the chat. There's some also on the chat, Douglas.
Okay. So Wendy is asking if you could kindly expand on input storytelling, in brackets gamepad as bad. How is abstraction of game input used as an advantage?
Yeah, so this is less common, I think, because it's really hard to do. Brothers is a really great example of it, and I think most games tend to sort of ignore the way the player interacts. So in terms of what the player does, it's very important, but in terms of specifically like physical things the game player is doing, like that doesn't get used very much in storytelling. And that game Brothers is fascinating because when you first start playing it, I don't know if you guys have played it, but it is worth picking up. It's really cheap these days, but it's such a fascinating little quirky thing. When you first start playing it and you're controlling 2 characters on one gamepad, it's really difficult, and you have to sort of train your brain to do it. So you feel very awkward at first, and then a few hours in, you're kind of controlling these 2 characters with each hand in a really kind of practiced, controlled way. So when later on in the game it takes away one of those characters, suddenly your brain really feels this kind of absence. And I think the interesting thing about it is that the game is acknowledging that players are interacting with games via this slightly weird thing. Like a gamepad is a really strange device, as is a keyboard, really. There's all these layers of abstraction, which in a movie or a novel, you don't really have that because you're a much more passive observer in terms of how the story is delivered. Whereas with a game, you have to be able to use a controller of some sort to do anything. And most games try to avoid kind of acknowledging that. But I think when games like Brothers do acknowledge it, it's quite interesting. If you look at the early Assassin's Creed games, they tried to do something like this, where the buttons they used on the controller were supposed to kind of map to the shape of the body, and in terms of like where your hands were and that kind of thing. But how well that worked, I'm not sure. Something that gets really interesting in this space actually is VR. So with virtual reality games, that's a whole different new kind of thing. So the fact that you're in VR in a physical representation of a space, and the way controllers work is that they represent your actual hands, to varying degrees. On the Quest, the Oculus Quest now, it does actual hand tracking, so you don't even need to use controllers. You see your fingers and your hands in the 3D space, and this opens up all kinds of interesting new storytelling options for developers, because suddenly you're not having to rely on a player being able to use a controller, and you're kind of removing all that abstraction, and suddenly it's the player in a space using their hands just in a very natural way. And if you look at VR games, they are able to make the mundane suddenly interesting. So in a non-VR game, opening a door, you normally press a button on the keyboard or on the gamepad, and the door opens, and it's not interesting. In a VR game, you reach out, you grab the handle, and you can open the door a crack and peek through it, or you can slam the door open and rush through, and you kind of get all that for free. And all of a sudden, the way a character opens a door in a movie, there's lots of different ways you could open a door, which can be like really boring or really dramatic or really tense or scary or whatever. in a non-VR game, it's very hard to do that. In VR, suddenly that works perfectly. And yeah, how storytellers are going to start using that new technology, I think, is going to be really exciting.
There's another question. When crafting the story, is it advisable to collaborate with the developers to include the game mechanics in the narrative?
I think whenever possible, that tends to be what gets the best results. So with Outer Wilds, they did that, and it sounded like the way I understand it is that the writing was done at the same time as developing the game, so they feel very woven together. They're one thing essentially. Whereas if the story comes at the end of the process, or essentially, you know, the game has been made and then a writer comes in to try and make sense of what's happening in it, then that's rarely going to be as effective. So yeah, the earlier you can get a writer on board, the better, really. And also in terms of that, obviously everyone has limitations in terms of their team and who you can afford to bring onto a project. But in the past, quite often the developers, the people doing the coding or the level design would also be the people doing the writing. And obviously some people are very capable of doing that. They're very good at both things. But just because you can code a game and you might be an amazing coder doesn't mean you can write a story. So I think it's important to be aware of particular skill sets, and bringing in a writer who specializes in that and can deliver that is just as important as, you know, hiring a good animator or a good modeler, that kind of thing.
Cool. And then how do you choose which type of storytelling you'll use in your game?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one, because for example, the type of storytelling and the type of perspective, you know, that is how you tell your story. And in a novel, the story is all that you have. In a game, you also have the mechanics of it and the systems and the way the player interacts. And you want to ideally find something that supports both of those things. And I think an interesting thing to think about is if you take something like Dear Esther or What Remains of Edith Finch, which are these very story-heavy first-person games, they're delivered in a first-person perspective, but they're very easy. There's very little challenge in them. You're basically exploring a space, and you walk through them, and the story is told to you. It works well for those games. But if you imagine those same stories being told in a really challenging platformer like, I don't know, Celeste or Super Meat Boy or something like that, then all of a sudden you could have the same story, but it's much harder for the player to get through the story. So then it's about kind of understanding the audience that you are going for, so that you don't mismatch. Because if you have a story that appeals to a certain type of person, but you put it in a game that type of person will never be able to play effectively, then it's not going to work well for anybody. So yeah, it's kind of all those decisions have to happen at the same time in a way. And whether you have a clear story you want to tell and then you decide what the game is, or whether you've got the game concept already and then you want to find a story to support it, it's just finding something that works in both directions, I suppose.
Okay, and then there's someone asking, Grace is asking, could you talk about your writing process when writing the games you've done?
Yeah, so like I mentioned at the start, I would definitely not call myself a games developer. I've worked on a few mini projects in Twine, interactive fiction stuff, which is mainly because I'm really interested in branching narrative and non-linear storytelling, but I've not really done anything outside of those small projects. But what I've learned from doing those is just how incredibly difficult it is. So, you know, when playing games like some of BioWare's stuff, or the Witcher games, or role-playing games, I remember in the past I was thinking, oh, why do you only get 3 dialogue choices? Like, why can't they do more? And then when you try and write branching dialogue yourself, you then discover just how difficult it is and how quickly that kind of thing can get out of control. So I tried doing a game which was a very simple setup where you basically get into an elevator in a building and the whole game takes place in that elevator and there's someone else in it with you and you have a conversation with them. And what I wanted to try and do was explore how natural I could get the flow of that conversation, which meant having lots and lots of different options that adjusted over time based on what you discovered from this other person. But it rapidly became almost impossible to keep track of the level of branching. So yeah, I'm kind of in awe of developers who do these massive open world games that have storytelling built in as well. And I think talking to John Ingold from Inkle Studios, an interesting thing that he kind of pointed out to me is that it doesn't always have to be massive decisions that you're giving the players. So in older role-playing games and some of the BioWare stuff, the decisions you're making would be really stark. So, you'd have the good option, which might be to help an old lady cross the road. And then at the same time, like the other decision you could make would be to go and burn her house down or something. That would be like the two options you'd have. And the game's always presenting every choice as the biggest choice you can make, and it's really dramatic. But what John Inkle said is that it's actually really effective to give players lots and lots of small choices that maybe don't impact on the plot in a massive way, but small choices like which seat are you going to sit on the bus, and what are you going to have for breakfast, and all these things can add up to a much richer experience for the player because it makes them feel like the person. They're making decisions all the time that maybe aren't kind of life-changing decisions, but most of us in our day-to-day lives are not making life-changing decisions. In our lives, we might have like a dozen mega decisions that we have to really think hard about, which will completely change everything. But outside of that, every day we're making decisions all the time, but they're not kind of like good and evil decisions. And if you can replicate that kind of smaller micro decision level, you can really suck the player in. So some of the later interactive fiction stuff I did was very much about exploring that and how kind of engaging with smaller things can actually have a bigger impact on the player. I'm not sure if that answered the question, but yeah.
Any other questions? I think a more general one is, will you be able to just share your slides maybe, and then I could share with those who are interested in it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'll send Douglas the link, and then that can be sent around to everyone, no problem.
Okay.
Douglas, I have a question.
Go ahead.
So, based on the current market trends, what games do you think perform better? Is it games that have story, like put an emphasis on the story, or games where the story takes more of a backseat?
I think it can be both. Like, I feel like for a while, like 10 years ago, it felt like single-player story-based games were kind of on the way out, and people, or at least the big publishers, didn't seem so interested in doing them. Like if you look at Electronic Arts and those kind of people, they were very much focusing on kind of esports and multiplayer stuff, and the focus would be on delivering a multiplayer experience that maybe sometimes would have a little story thing attached to it. Whereas now it feels like maybe the market and the audiences have diversified a bit and perhaps supports different types. So you look at the biggest games like Fortnite and Dota, and although they have storytelling in them, I don't think very few people play them because of the story. They play it because it's competitive and fun and social and that kind of stuff. But at the same time, you look at The Witcher 3, which is 5 years old now, and apparently in the last year sold as well as it did in its first year. So it seems like it can all do quite well these days. But yeah, it kind of depends on what model you want to go for, I suppose. I think with story-based games, it's maybe harder to make a long-term impact, whereas you look at some of the kind of ongoing service-based games, and they clearly have a model that works very well from a business perspective. Whereas if you want to have a Witcher 3 style successful single-player game, it's got to be pretty good for that to work.
Alright, so to that question is then what would be your advice to probably indie developers? Is it to pursue?
Your mic is shaky a bit, I think, Daniel.
Sorry?
Your mic was a bit fuzzy, but now we can hear you. Go ahead.
So I'm saying, what would be your advice to indie developers? Is it now to put more emphasis on the story, or just to concentrate on other aspects of the game?
Sorry, Daniel, I couldn't quite hear you. Do you want to put your question in chat?
All right.
There's one from Angelina. She's asking, what is interactive story writing and how does it differ from story writing? As Daniel types his question out.
Great. Yeah, I think in terms of interactive fiction, that's usually referring to when the player or the reader can directly impact on the way that story is told. So rather than being, a linear set of text that you read from start to finish, instead you have points where you can make decisions that then cause some kind of change, which could be big or small. So in kind of classic interactive fiction, it's deciding which direction to go in and how you solve puzzles and that kind of thing, or how you talk to people and that kind of stuff. In terms of like the process of writing it, I think it's not vastly different in the kind of sentence by sentence level, but from my limited experience of writing kind of branching interactive non-linear stuff, you just have to keep a lot more information in your head. So with a linear book, if I'm writing a novel, there's a lot of information, but it's kind of all in an order that it makes sense. There's only one kind of through line to keep track of, whereas with something that branches, you want to make all of those different branching options as satisfying for the player as the other ones. So you don't want any of those decisions to feel like the wrong decision. And that's where it gets really challenging, because suddenly, instead of writing, say, one story or one novel, you're writing hundreds of them, even though any given player will only encounter one of those routes in one playthrough. So you kind of have to also be at peace with the idea that you're putting a lot of effort into something that most people won't see most of it, which is a strange kind of experience, because again, from a scope and budget perspective, the idea of putting all this effort into content that a lot of people will never see can sometimes feel like a bad investment. But a lot of players respond really well to the idea of it being a kind of bigger world that they can't see all of. Like just the knowledge that there's other story stuff out there can be quite exciting in itself.
Angelina, I hope your question is answered. Daniel typed out, he asks, what would be advice to indie developers? Is it to put emphasis on the story or to concentrate on other aspects of the game?
I think the focus should always be on the game itself, because you can have the best story in the world, but if it's attached to a boring game, or if the game doesn't quite work, then that's going to damage the story. Whereas if you have an amazing game, whatever the story does can kind of only make it better, like unless you really mess up the story. But you can have an amazing game, put a little bit of story on top, and it makes it even better. If you put an amazing story on top, then suddenly you've got a classic game. Whereas, if you've got a great story but not much game, that's just not going to be a satisfying product for players. So the game should always be the priority. But as we've said earlier, the best solution is when the game and story kind of come into existence at the same time.
Okay. I think as a follow-up to Angela's original question, she asks, are adventure books considered interactive stories then?
Yeah, I'd say so. I think they existed before computers could easily do it, essentially. So particularly like in the 80s with the choose your own adventure stuff, that then evolved into the kind of early interactive fiction projects that you'd get, and that developed the Inform language that was around, it still is around, but it was particularly popular in the 90s, and then that's developed into stuff like Twine and Inkle's Ink engine and that kind of stuff. And yeah, in terms of text-based stuff, yeah, there's always been forms of this, and obviously some games have now taken this off in more complicated directions, where they maybe have retained the kind of essence of interactive fiction and adventure books, but have applied it to more complex game mechanics.
Vincent asked, he was late for the session. He wanted to find out your journey in game storytelling and what is your most satisfying achievement as far as game storytelling is concerned.
Yeah, so as you missed the start, you'll have missed the bit where I was saying how I wouldn't consider myself a game developer. I'm a writer. I write novels primarily and publish them online. But in terms of game writing, other than a few personal projects which I've done in Twine, I don't have massive experience. My interest is as a player and as a storyteller generally. I find games writing and game storytelling fascinating, but I do it very much as an observer. So in terms of personal achievements, not so much in that form. I mean, it's something that I've often thought about getting into more, but there's only so much time to write in the day, which is annoying. So my focus in recent years has been on novels. But yeah, getting into games writing more professionally would definitely be of interest, and I think that's why on the podcast I do at work, talking to John and Kelsey, it's fascinating to kind of hear from those people. In fact, I'll send the links to Douglas so you can share them as well. But those 2 podcast episodes are really worth listening to. John's in particular is basically an hour-long masterclass on how to write interactive fiction.
Yeah, that will definitely be helpful. Yeah, the no questions in the chat. Anyone else? Question, thoughts, comments? Maybe Simon, you could throw a question to the participants. Seems there are no more questions from our end.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'd be really interested to know, it's come up a few times now in terms of kind of the development team and how to approach writing. So I'd love to know some of the teams that are here, do they have writers on their teams, and kind of where they're at in terms of developing stories? Is it something that they've not done before but they're trying to get into? Do they have dedicated staff who are focusing on that aspect? I'd just be really curious to know where everybody is at in terms of that aspect of development.
Anyone who wants to have a go at a question or comment?
I could. I think you see, as an ecosystem locally, it's still quite a new ecosystem. It's just getting started. So also there's that angle of awareness that needs to work around what are the like various elements in a game, what are the sort of various talents and skills that are needed in a game and all that. So see, very much people like in the figuring out stages. So you'd find that maybe a few a few of the guys like Internet of Elephants, all that accomplished, sort of do have a very good idea on the structure of how teams are going to work and all that. But I sort of had expected questions like, do you need talent and all that to sort of show up at this moment in time, I guess. So it's getting there. It's not there yet, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if anyone has a different perspective on that.
There's a question from Astronaut. He's asking, do you have any advice on how to depict culture within the story of the game? And maybe just anyone else who wants to answer Ahmed's question or comments. Simon?
Yeah, in terms of depicting culture, I mean, it's like any other storytelling medium, I think, in that you want to make sure you have a deep understanding of whatever you're trying to depict and respect for it. You don't want to be, unconsciously kind of appropriating stuff. But in terms of games, where they have particular, I think all storytelling has to have some kind of empathy, some kind of empathic element to it, and that's the real power of fiction and storytelling, which is that for a moment it gives you a way to examine the world through somebody else's eyes, whether it's a movie or a book or a game or whatever. But in games in particular, because they're interactive and because the player is in there making decisions, you can cause them to reconsider their perspectives and shine a light on viewpoints and that kind of thing through interaction, and particularly in terms of understanding other people. So just one example that came to mind in terms of that kind of thing is Depression Quest, which came out a few years ago, and that was a really interesting use of interactive fiction to try and examine ideas around depression, in that it was kind of a classic text adventure in that you'd read a bit of text and then you'd have, say, 3 options that you could pick to go to the next bit. But one of the options would, be the good option in terms of mental health, whereas the other 2 would be, less good ideas from a personal health perspective. And the good option that you'd want to click, when you tried to click it, it would be crossed out, so you couldn't select it. So you then have to choose one of the other 2. I think what's interesting about that is that it then gives them an insight into the way decision making works for some people who are suffering from something like depression. And where that's unique to games is that you could read a book about that or watch a movie about it, but you're just being told about a character or about other circumstances. So you're kind of an observer of it. Whereas what that developer could do through a game was force the player to experience a little bit of what it's like to be in that situation. And I think any time you can do that, where the player is no longer sort of a passive person, but is experiencing, whether it's something like depression or whether it's exploring a particular culture or ideas and concepts, you're really able to challenge that person in a way that's slightly different to the way literature or movies or comics or other forms can do it, because the player has to more actively confront their own thoughts on it. It's a bit like when we were talking earlier about Spec Ops, The Line, and you're forced into this moment halfway through the game where you basically commit a war crime, and different players reacted in different ways to it, but nobody came away from that without some kind of opinion. So yeah, it's a good way to explore this kind of stuff because it feels quite personal. I'm not sure if that answered the question. Hopefully it did.
I hope as well. So I think Angelina just got back to you in terms of if some of the people here have given it a thought. She says that their focus has been on development, but she definitely feels there needs to be more thought to add value to the player's experience. Ahmed, she also agrees with your comment. And then Joel asks, is there any resource that you would recommend to people who are new to narrative development and want to learn about narrative and story development in games? Maybe that ties into your presentation, but yes, if you do have other resources, you could share, and then I'll definitely pass it on to them.
Yeah, no, I'll send you a few links. I think the main thing probably is if you have particular games that you appreciate storytelling, try and look at the credits and try and figure out who the writers were, who the narrative designers were, and hunt them down on Twitter or on their websites, because a lot of these people do blog and write about what they do, or you might find them showing up on podcasts, and generally they're very happy to share knowledge. I think I was just looking at Angelina's comment about how as a continent it's kind of early days still, but I think in terms of game development anywhere, it still feels very early days for storytelling, which is why it's so exciting, and you never know what's going to happen. So every new game that comes out potentially is going to do it in a new way, which is really thrilling. Whereas you buy a new book, might be an amazing story, it might be a new style of writing, but the process of a book telling a story is kind of fixed now. And yeah, I think just look up other writers basically, and see what they're saying. Yeah.
Cool. Maybe we could take the last three questions as we look to wrap up. Going once. Comments, maybe. So I think from my side, I'd like to thank you very much, Simon, for taking your time this morning to walk us through this session. We definitely appreciate it. And for the participants also, thank you for taking time to log in, ask your questions, and learn a thing or two. This was the first part in a three-part series focused on storytelling. So we'll have two other speakers over the next 2 months, at least, also sharing different angles around storytelling. So do look out for the poster and next session. But as we usually have this meetup every second Saturday of the month from 10 a.m. to noon, I definitely look forward to having you on for the next build-up session. So thank you so much, and do have a great rest of the weekend. I'll get the sessions from Simon and pass on this to you. Thanks.
Great. Yeah, I just want to say thanks as well for coming along. That was really fun. I really enjoyed it. And thanks for asking me to come along.
Thank you. Have a good one. Bye. Thank you all. I'll wrap up the call. Yeah.